Welcome to the Thrive Podcast with the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church.
How does your faith kind of play into it, or does it play into it?
What can be done about it? When I say the church, I'm talking about evangelical white Christians and the black folk who attend their churches.
Hello, welcome to the Thrive Podcast with the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. I'm Fred Jeff Smith, pastor of Shiloh, and I'm very happy that you chose to share with us either through YouTube viewing us or through iTunes, Spotify, or Amazon Prime Music viewing us. We're grateful for you taking the time to share with us in the Thrive Podcast today. As I said the last time we were together, we're trying to get back on course. The pandemic had knocked us out of doing weekly interviews as we have historically done, but we're glad to be able to get back to somewhat of a regular routine of these interviews. And as a part of that, I do want to remind you that we are open to suggestion and comment about the podcast. You can reach me at fredjeffsmith@cox.net. Fred Jeff Smith at cox.net. Let us know how we're doing with the Thrive Podcast and how we might be able to do better. I'm very happy today to welcome as a guest of our podcast Mr. Eric B. Lewis, who is currently a candidate for our East Baton Rouge Parish Metro Council District 1. Mr. Lewis, thank you for taking the time to come and share with us today.
Thank you for allowing me to share some time with you. I really appreciate it.
Tell us, who is Eric Lewis? I know a lot about you primarily through the work that you did with Apex Collegiate Academy and the school that you had established. But tell us, what's the background of Eric Lewis?
So I'm originally from Baton Rouge. I grew up in the Glen Oaks community, attended high school there. I graduated from Southern University in electrical engineering. After graduation, I moved to Dallas, Texas, worked for Texas Instruments for about 4 years, and then relocated to North Louisiana or Central Louisiana in Alexandria, and all within my professional career. Mm-hmm. And then eventually had the opportunity to relocate back to Baton Rouge, and I guess and so as an adult, that was my first time actually living in the city as an adult, and immediately got involved in the community. Obviously my church, so I was I'm a deacon at my church, Sunday school superintendent, taught Sunday school, but also got involved outside the church in organizations like Forum 35, was one of the co-founders of the Baton Rouge Regional Black Chamber of Commerce, was active in NAACP, just a number of different things in the community, all centered around this idea that I wanted to reverse the trend of why I actually left to begin with. And so I left, I wasn't necessarily a social person, but I left for a job opportunity. But the reality is that, comparing my experience in Dallas to what was going on in Baton Rouge, and this is about 20 years ago, is vastly different. And so there's a lot of opportunities professionally, a lot of things for young families to do in the community and things like that. And so working with those organizations that I mentioned, it was just a push to kind of create the type of wholesome community and a quality of life for young people that would attract people here and retain people. And so I continue to do that work. You mentioned, Apex Collegiate Academy. Sometime prior to that, I began getting involved in educational advocacy. Had an opportunity to sit down with your father when I was doing some of that work. And then that actually led me to this opportunity to launch a charter school, honestly, for Black children in North Baton Rouge. That didn't end the way that we wanted it to, but what people may not realize is, even though I don't run a school anymore, I continue to do that same work because at the end of the day, I feel like our children need uplifting, they need access, and they need opportunity. And so that's something I'll continue to do regardless of the title that I hold.
You mentioned you left Baton Rouge because of a job opportunity. One of the things that I lament regularly, both on this podcast and outside of this form of media, is the brain drain that seems to be taking place, especially with African Americans with regard to Baton Rouge. We raise them, we educate them, and then they have to go someplace else to find jobs. Houston, Dallas, Cincinnati, Atlanta, Nashville seem to get the cream of our crop. As one who left and came back, could you go into a little bit more detail about how stark the contrast was in coming home from where you were in Dallas?
Well, one of the things, as I go into that, one of the things that's always been puzzling to me is that, for years you would see spring graduations at Southern and kids talking about they couldn't find jobs here. But at the same time, within our business community, like we're constantly hearing that we don't have talent. And so there's something that's not adding up there. And so I'll just, kind of go through again, to your point. And I'll even make it current. So about 6 months, actually prior to the pandemic, my son and I went to Dallas. And again, that's been almost 20 years. But it's just Dallas 20 years ago versus today is even drastically different. And so I think part of it is this idea that we want to include young people in the development of the city and the transition and transformation of the city. We talk a lot about progressivism, but I think it's more than just a social idea. Like, we have traditions in Baton Rouge that we hold strong to, some that are good, some that are not. And so we have to be open to different people coming in and being a part of a conversation. And I'll be honest, like if I look at our city government now, how many folks that have been held over from multiple administrations. Whereas, again, we have people that have worked in, entry-level positions that have been since left the city, again, moved on to other opportunities or moved out of the city. And so I feel like part of our stranglehold and our limited opportunities for growth is we continue to seem to have an inner circle of folks that run things around this community. And I don't, like at this point, it's become beyond a race issue, but we have to be open to listening to new ideas and hearing different perspectives and hearing from different people. And that's one thing that I think that I've seen both in Dallas where I live and in other major cities where I've traveled, is there's a diversity of thought. Multiple people have the opportunity to infuse change in their communities. And so we have to understand that it's not just elected officials that have the answers. It's not just prescribed leadership that have the answers. We have talented people in our community that have solutions that we need to be listening to and hearing to. And I think that's probably the biggest difference that I've seen in my experience.
Tell me about District 1. It is currently held by Trey Welch, who is term limited and is leaving the Metro Council. Give me the geographic boundaries of
Yes, sir.
District 1.
So if we go to the parish line all the way up to East Feliciana, we start there, and then we come down 61 where the old Jetson Correctional Center was.
Right.
So that's kind of the boundary on the scenic highway side. Down Highway 19, you go all the way down to Baker Boulevard. And if you swerve within there, it actually goes down as far as Groom Road in Baker.
Okay.
Excluding like the downtown portion of Baker. Go all the way across Groom Road, across Plank Road. I think that's Bob Pettit, and then it weaves over to Central at like Dyer Road, and then you come back up Blackwater, and then the Greenwood Springs Pride Road, Highway 64. You take that all the way to Greenwood Springs, and so all of that Cheneyville Pride is a part of it as well.
It's huge geographically.
Yes, sir. Massive.
And it's growing population-wise. You take in almost all of Zachary.
All
Am
of
I
Zachary.
correct to that?
All of
you
Zachary.
have all of Zachary. You have portions of Baker, and you have portions of Central.
Portions of Central, and then, like I said, all of the unincorporated areas of Pride and Cheneyville,
Right.
and unincorporated Port Hudson.
So, from your perspective as a candidate for Metro Council, what do you see as the distinctive need of District 1 as opposed to, say, District 10, which is where we are now?
Yes, sir. So that's actually an interesting question, because I think oftentimes, and if you talk to leaders in Zachary, and it will, if you focus on Zachary, if you talk to leaders in Zachary, there's this conflict in that we feel isolated, when I say we, I'm saying leadership in Zachary feels isolated from the rest of the parish.
Right.
And so when we talk about resources such as drainage and roads and things of that nature, there's this feeling, There was the issue recently with Breck. And so there's this feeling that, again, resources are isolated and not equitably dispersed in the northern part of the parish. But you also have, which, you will get leadership in Zachary to admit, that folks in Baton Rouge think that Zachary's this wealthy, elite community and doesn't necessarily need these resources. But here's the reality. I think that, and so it's a valid question, but I think the reality is what I found in talking to folks is that a lot of the issues and challenges that folks in District 10 have, folks in the northern part of the parish had those same issues and challenges. People were hyperventilating and feeling anxiety this past week because of the hurricane, because we have a lack of maintenance going on with ditches, canals, bayous, and whatnot in the area. Grass cutting. We got at least two bridges. One's been out for a year, one's been out for 5 years. That's diverting traffic and causing concerns. Public safety is an issue and a concern. Educational attainment. And you probably look at me and you're like, wait a minute, I thought you had the #1 school district in the state. All right,
but now, you don't want my opinion about that. I don't count 3 schools as a district, to be totally honest with you. But I wasn't going to bring that up. But since you did,
here's the reality: if we go back to the school that I started, I had a number of kids at our school that lived in Zachary, and so I think as a community, like we have to talk through that, And so there are kids that live in Zachary that don't go to school in Zachary for a number of different reasons. But again, and so when we talk about educational attainment and providing a quality education for all children in our community, I think that's a conversation that we have to have in District 1 as well. And so we have 5 pillars in our campaign, again, which I believe everybody in the community can relate to. So being youth development, educational attainment, infrastructure and drainage, economic development, and public safety. But I think the larger issue is, for me, is I think that we have to have someone representing District 1 who understands that, like, we can talk all we want about having a #1 school district and people flocking up there because of the schools, but if we don't have quality of life in District 1 and people are still, coming into Baton Rouge for all the services that they need. So my point has always been that, District 1, District 10, like, we're all in this together. And so if something is adversely impacting District 10, then I care about it. Because again, I shop, I eat, I may go to church. I have a child that lives in District 10, So I think one of the challenges that we have to do going into this next Metro Council administration is we have to do a better job of collaboration, a better job of working together and finding common issues that impact us all in order for our community to move forward.
Erica Green was here the other day.
Great interview.
And
great interview.
We talked about the various needs that exist within districts. And one of the things that we talked about had to do with the racial composition of the Metro Council.
Yes, sir.
And the political composition of the Metro Council. As it currently exists, and it's about to change. I know we're voting in a couple of weeks. It's 7-5 Republican, Democrat, 7-5 white, black. And I asked her, and I'm curious as to what your answer is the racial composition the majority, the primary issue, or is the political philosophy the primary driving issue for the tribalism that seems to exist within the Metro Council? Is it because the 7 Republicans are white and the 5 Democrats are black, or is it because there are 7 Republicans and 5 Democrats?
So I don't know. I mean, I know 75% of the council members. Like I've known them for some time. Mm-hmm. I know, but I also, like, that question also, like, always concerns me, and it's a valid question, but it concerns me because I think, too often here lately, people deem Republicans to have ownership on conservatism, mm-hmm. right? I grew up. I'm a registered Democrat, going to church all my life. But I think that if people knew my family and my upbringing, they would call us conservative. And I dare not say several of those other black people that are on the council in many ways would be conservative as well. And so I feel like we have to be careful about that. I do think, but I think it's both issues. Because I'll also say that, Trey Welch, as an example, like when he ran the first time and won, he won as a Democrat. I've known Trey for quite a while, know his family, and I can attest to several people, and I'm sure Trey can too, that he's grown up and that he's friends with that are black and Democrat. And so I think at the end of the day, we need principled leadership, and we need to do what's right because it's right, not because we're Democrat or Republican, or not because we're black or white. And I think too often, like, that's what we're missing is like true, legitimate, principled leadership. And so I guess the most recent, you might have another one, but the example that I tend to throw out is the ruling on the Alton Sterling case.
Yes.
Okay, so people have thrown out like all the things about his past or whatnot, and it's become a racial issue. But at the same time, like, we can say that we're conservative and we don't want to, spend the people's money, but we look at all the people's money that we've been spending during this pandemic.
Sure.
All right, and so at the end of the day, I do think that people may kowtown and do groupthink based on their race or their Democratic Party. But at the end of the day, my concern is that we need to have principled leadership on the council, and that's an example where I've not seen principled leadership from one side.
So help me to understanding. You mentioned that Councilman Welch ran initially as a Democrat, won as a Democrat,
Yes, sir.
came back and ran and won as a
Well,
Republican.
actually, he's never actually had to run.
As a Republican.
He's never been contested as a Republican.
Okay. All right. But he did switch parties.
He did switch parties,
Okay.
yes, sir.
I appreciate the clarification. One of your opponents has been on the Metro Council in a different district, and he served as a Democrat.
Yes, sir.
And I was quite surprised doing a little research preparing for this interview to find that he's currently listed as a Republican. I'm not going to ask you about the switching. I'm going to ask you from your perspective, how do you distinguish between Republican and Democrat?
Well, now that is one thing that I will say about the town of Zachary. Not necessarily Metro District 1, but the town of Zachary. Since I've lived there, I have seen that people don't tend to, move in the corners based on parties. I mean, in fact, there are independents that are on the city council in Zachary. And so I think, I've voted. I mean, I'm a registered Democrat. I voted for Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. For me, I think what has happened lately is that the national parties are defining what's a Republican and a Democrat. I think, from my perspective, and the way that I grew up, Democrats were focused on making sure the least of these were served. Characterized by a high level of compassion. Those are probably the two biggest things that I can recall growing up.
Terrible things, right? High level of compassion and concerned about the least.
That's
Quite
literally
biblical. Just saying, it's quite biblical.
Go ahead, Pastor.
I'm trying to get a distinction between Democrats and Republicans, and based upon what you just said, it sounds to me like, from your perspective, Democrats embrace a more Jesus concern about the needs of the marginalized as opposed to Republicans. I am not putting words in his mouth. I'm simply basing it on what he said. So,
I've had this conversation with a gentleman that I know. I would consider him a friend, but there have been political debates. Actually, several people, not necessarily about my race, but just about that conversation. On social media, there's all these sorts of memes and stuff. And I think recently, one of these friends of mine just blasted Democrats to hell. And so, again, I think it's from a national perspective and national platforms. And so when we bring in issues, like abortion, like capital punishment, spending, government spending and things like that, that's where we tend to delineate. And that's not to suggest that people at a local level as an individual don't, align with those principles or whatnot. But I think at the end of the day, from a local standpoint, like, we have to be concerned about our children, our city. We have kids dying on the street. We got kids missing. We got kids that are not being properly educated. We have under-resourced communities throughout this parish. Again, if we look, prime example, again, going back to District 1, we had 3, maybe 4 neighborhoods the day that the storm was coming, where drains were plugged in their neighborhoods. And so I definitely believe, I believe in, climate change. But like, this was a matter of drains being plugged in their neighborhoods. And so if we could get the local government out to unplug the drains, then their neighborhoods wouldn't have flooded.
So help me with that.
So the thing is, so my point is that, on one hand, I'm sitting in a majority black neighborhood,
right,
enraged.
Right.
But then I saw that that was going on in, a little bit more well-to-do neighborhood as well. And so at the end of the day, the government's not working for any of us.
So is that a Zachary City Council issue, or is that an East Baton Rouge Parish Metro Council
So
issue?
in the instance that I dealt with, it's both.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, so the particular street that I was on was in the Zachary city limits.
Okay.
And the young lady, the neighbor, could not get, she just kept calling the government, and they wouldn't come. And they were going to call, and they were going to call.
She called city government, parish government?
City
government.
They wouldn't come. So then I said, okay, well, somebody suggested that I call the parish. And after going through several loops, the young man on the other line said, well, sir, that's within Zachary city limits. We're never to come out there. And I said, okay, but at the end of the day, this is still part of the parish. And he said, I get that, but we're not going to come out there. That's in Zachary city limits. But I can go to the unincorporated areas, and again, I've talked to folks who live next to canals that have flooded during these hurricanes, and so that is why. So those are examples as to why, like, the whole party thing is just disturbing to me, because at the end of the day, when a storm comes, it doesn't ask what's your party affiliation.
Sure.
When a virus comes, as it has, it's not ask any of those 200,000 people that died what their party affiliation is. And so I think we spend entirely too much time focus on what our labels are rather than serving the people's needs.
Is there a tension that exists?
You like that one there?
I'm just going. You don't have to swing it every pitch. I'll let that one go by. Is there a tension? I live in the city of Baton Rouge.
Yes, sir.
So I don't have the issue that you have. You live within the metro area of District 1, but you also live within the city
Yes, sir.
of Zachary. Is there a tension that exists between the city council of Zachary and the metro council, or the way government is administered on a city basis versus a parish basis?
Yeah, I don't know how intense it is, but again, and this is based on like literal conversations I've had with leaders. And again, I think the two biggest issues that I've gotten feedback on, and these are based on conversations I've had, are around, again, drainage, infrastructure maintenance type issues, as well as I think for the city of Zachary, the concern that has bubbled up is around planning and zoning. And so, the city of Zachary's boundaries are set. To my understanding from conversations I've had, there's no desire to annex unincorporated parts of Zachary.
Okay.
And so there are communities or neighborhoods that are, Zachary addresses, but are not within the city limits. And so I think part of the challenge becomes, if it goes before the Planning and Zoning Commission for EBR, the city actually has no say in it. And so they may, while we may have a master plan or whatnot, and I'm sure if you've seen this, like there's deviations that happen all the time. So I think there's like a lot of concerns around planning and zoning, both from a facade standpoint, but then also being able to provide services. And so from my understanding, there's some neighborhoods that are like basically in the Zachary school district, but are outside the city limits of Zachary, who aren't receiving public services like water, police, fire. All right. And so I do think that is a huge opportunity to have those level of conversations, even though it's a city that's been incorporated, for umpteen years. It seems like that's a conversation that needs to happen. I think the other thing that's come up, and again, people probably saw this in the media, was around brick. And so I think there are two brick parks within the Zachary area. But again, those two that I'm referring to, I know one for certain is outside of the city limits. And so concern about how much maintenance or whatnot is being received. And I don't like that conversation there. I think is, again, a matter of people coming to the table, because I think there's perspectives on both sides that people may not be seeing clearly about. So I think those are probably the two biggest issues that I'm aware of, is around maintenance, and then maintenance of facilities and roads, parks, and then, as I mentioned, planning and zoning.
The Metro Council has no official administrative latitude with regard to public education, but I know that you were part of a charter school program, an integral part of that program, so I know that you have a love for education. From the bully pulpit of the Metro Council, what would be your position with regard to the educational needs that exist within East Baton Rouge Parish? So
I think that we have to, and a lot of people might not agree with my perspective on this, but I think we have to acknowledge that from an aptitude standpoint, our children are not finishing high school at a level that they need to be able to compete. And that's not all, because kids are leaving there and getting jobs.
Right.
But I think we need to have a much larger percentage of our kids finishing high school at a level and an aptitude to where they can make the choice of whether or not they want to go to college or go into the workforce or a trade. And so I think as a Metro Council, like, we have an opportunity to be able to do that. One of the things, so the city does have responsibility over Head Start centers.
Okay.
So that is a pipeline in the education system. But I also think that, from a youth development standpoint, the city does provide funding and grants, either directly or indirectly, for a number of youth programs over the years. And so we need to be in collaboration with our educational partners at the district level, or private schools, or public charter schools, or what have you. Because at the end of the day, like, we're all in this. Like, we can't just subjugate that responsibility to education policymakers when there's decisions that we make as a Metro Council that will impact schools. Safety concerns, public safety issues that we make decisions on that impact our schools. And so I do think, and if you look at some other cities, and I'm not suggesting like we do some, we were talking earlier about the Constitution, I'm not saying that we do some constitutional amendment, to give the city parish more authority over schools. But what I am suggesting is that if you look at other cities, it probably is, like DC as an example, it's probably much more integrated. New York, places like that. There are several other examples. I do think as a Metro Council, like, we have to take an active role and active involvement in ensuring that our children receive the type of education that they deserve. So I won't be a council member that uses that excuse, well, that's not our responsibility.
And I respect that and appreciate that perspective. In that Apex was a charter school, was it a public charter or a private charter?
It's public.
It was a public charter. Do you have an opinion about charters versus public schools?
Yes. My opinion.
Do you care to share it?
I will share it.
Okay.
So my opinion is that I think that, and I'm very big on this, I think that all of our schools all schools, anybody that's given government money to educate children should be held accountable. Now, we all may disagree on how that is to be, but like there has to be a level of accountability for all schools. I've never been one that felt like a charter school, it was charter school versus a traditional public school. I think that the way that the law is established in Louisiana, it gives charter schools flexibility in a number of different areas. Not accountability, which people seem to think, but charter schools do have some level of flexibility in the way that they achieve their goals of educating our children. And I think that public schools should have that flexibility as well. I know that EBR has tried that a couple times with some experiments within their schools that they run by creating these different zones. And so, at the end of the day, my challenge to us as a community is to push all of our schools to make sure, and I said this early and I stand by this, my challenge is to push all of us, not just as educators, but our community at large, to ensure that we give every single child in this community the type of education where they're positioned and empowered to make decisions for themselves when they finish. My frustration is that for too long, we funnel kids into certain categories based on whatever test that they took in the second or third grade, right, and decided what track they were going to take. I acknowledge and understand that everybody may not choose to go to college, but the greatest level of freedom is for you to be able to make that decision yourself, and not for that to be placed upon you back in the third or fourth grade, and now you're going down a path, and then you realize when you get to 11th grade, you can't go to college even though you desire to. And so I just think that that's where our focus needs to lie. I really don't think it's an either or. I think that again, everybody that receives public funding, government funding, should have some level of accountability, and it should be an even playing field. But I also think that our charge needs to be empowering our children so that they can make life decisions when they come of age. And too many of our children are having decisions made for them.
Let's go back to the Louisiana State Constitution, because I know you're running for Metro Council, but one of the upcoming amendments deals with the Industrial Tax Exemption Program, Amendment 5, and it allows for corporations to negotiate directly with entities within city and parish government in order to skirt paying property taxes. We'll pay you X amount of dollars in lieu of paying what we actually owe in property taxes. Do you think I have a problem with that? Yeah, I do. The Metro Council is one of those entities.
Yes.
So, assuming that you are successful in your campaign, it will become part of your decision as to whether or not corporations pay their fair share in property taxes. Do you have an opinion on Amendment 5?
Yeah, so I think, and if I'm not mistaken, I think part of the reason this became a big issue is because the state was bypassing local municipalities. And so I think from that regards, because we've been asked this question in several forums, so I think that the local municipalities should have the authority to decide whether or not they forgive taxes or obligations from anybody that's coming to do business in their community. But what I've gone a step further, and I don't know that I've ever heard this mentioned. I was in a leadership program some years ago, and we learned about this thing called community benefit agreements. And so I think the bigger conversation, so I think to answer your question, I believe that as a Metro Council, we should have the authority to have those negotiations. But I think what should happen is a part of that process is that we should have tools in place such as community benefit agreements that, in addition to taxes, and if a corporation is saying that they will do something in lieu of, we need to have folks from the community at the table, and we need to lay out literally how this is going to benefit our community. And so at the end of the day, if we are, not receiving funding for whatever reason, but then we don't see a return on that investment in the community in the way of jobs, in the way of additional training, and again, because this is typically what's taken place in Louisiana over the years, additional greenhouse gases or reduction in environmental issues within our community, then again, we just continue to fail. And so I do think that, while we should have the authority to negotiate, I do think that we need to take it a step further and making sure that we're bringing folks from the community to the table to participate in this conversation, so that we understand and we guarantee that in the end, the people within the community actually benefit from this. If that makes sense.
I want to be clear on what you're saying. You're saying that the Metro Council, the school board, and the sheriff's office, which are the three entities in East Baton Rouge Parish government that get to vote up or down on ITEP proposals, should have the ability to do that. On that, we agree.
Yes, sir.
But I don't agree with Amendment 5. I don't agree that
Tell me why.
X company should be able to come to the Metro Council and say, in lieu of the $22 million, now I'm just pulling numbers out of my head, in lieu of the $20 million that we owe in property taxes, we'll pay you $4 million. And the Metro Council say, that's okay.
Oh, no, I don't.
I don't think that X company should be able to come and say, we have no guarantee of jobs. We have but we're going to pay this amount of money, and you all should be happy that we're giving you this amount of money. And that's essentially what Amendment 5 does. It says that you can skirt paying what you actually owe in taxes. I wish they would allow individuals the right to skirt. I don't want to pay what I owe, but I'll give you $10. Is that okay? You'll be okay with me giving you $10 to instead of paying what I owe in taxes? I just think it's fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And so that's where I say like the community benefit agreement or some tool similar to that, because at the end of the day, like it has to be equitable. And so, in business, if we're making an investment, then there's a return that we're expecting. And so, if to take your example, the 20 plus million that we're going to forego, okay, so that 4 plus some jobs or a list of other things.
But the amendment doesn't require jobs.
That's what
doesn't require anything like that at all. It just says we'll pay you some cash in lieu of doing all the other things. And it is a you said you don't like talking about conservative liberal, but it's a conservative state legislature that is pushing this because they got mad because a Democratic governor said, I'm going to restore the rights of individual communities and governments to decide for themselves whether or not these corporations, which reside in our community and consume an awesome amount of our services. We ain't got no water because corporations are taking our fresh water. I don't know if y'all been paying attention to that. The aqueducts are becoming filled with salt water, and fresh water is being depleted in East Baton Rouge Parish. We don't get our water from the river, even though we sit on the river. We get our water from underground aqueducts, and that water is being depleted by corporations, but they don't want to pay taxes.
And so, how many times have you heard what you explained with that amendment? How many times have you heard that explained? Because here's another concern that I have that I'm hoping that you were going to get into. And so we have these amendments that are laid out in 1 or 2 sentences, and that's probably the most in-depth explanation that I've heard of it yet. And so part of what I really want to see is us as a people get more engaged in this process so that, again, 28 years down the road, my grandkids aren't looking at me and talking about, Papa, what did you just do?
Yeah.
So how do we get our people more engaged and understand?
If we're talking about Amendment 5, when the people were engaged and went down to the state legislature, the amendment never got out of committee. The conservative legislature, how y'all doing? The conservative legislature waited until a pandemic when no one could come to the subcommittee meetings, and they passed the amendment with an empty room.
Yes, sir.
And so I understand what you're saying about engagement, but I'm pointing out the difference between the fact that we were engaged when we could be engaged on this issue. There are issues that we're not engaged on that we should be, but we were engaged on this issue.
Well, no, what I'm saying is I'm not saying that. How do I put this? So, like your point driving at what I'm saying is, so we have to understand that it's a long game.
Yes.
And so some folks found the opportunity to get what they wanted when people weren't looking, and we have to be aware of that. Is my point. So how do we strengthen that?
Well, thank God I'm not running for for public office. But I just know that, assuming that you will be sitting on the council, this is going to come up.
Yeah, and so I think, again, so there are a number of instances like that where, what's the word that we typically use? Systemic. So that's a number of this systemic word, where as leaders, when we see things in policy or the rules that are in place, like we have to be prepared to be synergistic and strategic to ensure that, the best interest of people is constantly being met. And so, God forbid this passes, but let's say it does. Like, again, as a council member, it's my job to be aware of that. And at the council level, put policies, ordinances in place to work within those rules until somebody, comes up and declares it unconstitutional.
Why is there no movie theater in Zachary?
Wow, it's just be coming with it, don't you?
Well, I have looked at all of the development that has taken place within Zachary over the past 15, 20 years.
Yes, sir.
And I have formed in my mind the opinion that once Zachary gets a movie theater, y'all gonna say, forget Baton Rouge. We staying up here.
So
it's the only thing. You have shopping centers, you have restaurants, you have what you all call the number one public school system in the state of Louisiana, but there's no movie theater.
Yes, sir. So I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
It's my way of humorously getting into the need for economic expansion within.
And so the thing is that, again, I have that same question, about North Baton Rouge in general. And again, that's another example where I think leaders in Zachary, when they hear North Baton Rouge, like they want folks in Baton Rouge to understand that North Baton Rouge doesn't stop at Harding Boulevard or Groom Road or what have you. And so I don't know the answer to that question. I know that, if we talk about like Hollow Place, when it first came under wraps, from an economic development standpoint, like that's a valid question. Like we got people from East Feliciana, West Feliciana, Point Capee, Zachary, Baker, driving right past Hollow Place to go to South Baton Rouge to go to the movies. And that's probably like nearly half the population in the metro region that's driving right past North Baton Rouge. Right. And so I think part of it needs to be, again, collaboration, and we can't like do things in pockets. Just like all the other council districts, about 30,000+ voters in Metro Council District 1. But again, like we're drawing from, people come from West Feliciana, East Feliciana to eat in Zachary. And so I think it has to be, again, more of a regional approach. As leaders in the Zachary community, we have to ensure that we're being involved in collaboration with folks in Baton Rouge to attract those opportunities. You give the movie theater example. We had a Captain D's that closed like right before the pandemic, so that building is sitting there vacant. So there's more opportunities for restaurants. But then if you look at the rural portions that are very majestic and beautiful, I think there's other opportunities as far as seniors and maybe resorts and outdoor type activities that would again attract people, attract business, and attract residents to the northern part of the parish. And so I think not passing any judgment, but just what I've seen working throughout the community, I just think it's still a stronger cry for much more collaboration.
The one thing I'll give St. George, or the proposed community of St. George, is that they seem to be well along the way of economic advancement as opposed to Zachary, unfortunately, Baker now,
Yes, sir.
because a lot has left the Baker area. So I was just curious, are there plans in the works for greater economic expansion within that Zachary Cheneyville area?
Yeah, so again, just based on conversations I've had with folks, it's, and I used to live in Central, and it was kind of the same thing in Central. Like, people just like this quiet, sleepy town feel. But again, if I compare this to other places that I live, like, that's not how you attract, this generation that we're trying to attract. And so I don't, so again, I think there's a particular mindset of what, or a vision of what folks want Zachary to be like. And I just think, over time, as there's a change in leadership, then we'll probably begin to see some changes.
What's the crime problem like in the Zachary area? In District 1, I shouldn't limit it to Zachary, in District 1.
So I don't actually have like specific statistics. I will say, and you've probably seen some of this stuff on the news, like the beginning of the pandemic. In Zachary, there were a number of shootings. And then I think about 2-3 weeks ago, there was, I wouldn't call it a mass shooting, but like 6 people got shot in Baker and within the district. And so, again, it's no different from the rest of the community. I think the 2 or 3 recent shootings in Zachary itself were all domestic related, which again illustrates that, like, we're having a lot of the same problems. I think there was a shooting before the pandemic happened, like at or near the school, some kid or something shot at the school. There are, multiple instances of, car break-ins and things like that go on. But I mean, overall, like, it's relatively safe, but, crime happens everywhere in this parish. So it's not, like, Zachary's not necessarily, Metro District 1 is not isolated from the ills that the rest of the parish is facing. And what I also, and so before I say this, so I think that all these instances that I've talked about are people that live in our community, in Metro Council District 1. But I think we all, and I say this frequently, like, we also have to be very careful of turning our nose down on, like, what's going on in Baton Rouge, because I drive in and out of Zachary all the time, and I don't see any security gates, any walls, like, preventing people from getting in. So, like, this is our entire community. There's no borders. And so, like, everybody has to be engaged in addressing this problem. Not sure if you will get here, but, which I've lived in Zachary for 4 years, but, like, campaigning has shown, again, poverty, and housing, or quality housing, is a huge challenge in District 1, just like it is in other parts of this community. And then lastly, what this pandemic has shown, like, I've seen, like, huge food lines, both for seniors, because there's a council and aging center in Zachary, so I've seen huge food lines there, but as well as, like, different organizations giving the bulk boxes away. The community center near my house, every Tuesday morning, there's lines. And so again, this pandemic is hurting us all. Crime is hurting us all. Everybody throughout the parish is being adversely impacted by the downturn in the economy. And so that, from my vantage point, I just think we've had too much division, for too many years in the city. And at some point we have to realize, that, again, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, like, we all have a lot of the same issues going on in our neighborhoods. Some might not be as well publicized, but we all have the same issues going on in our neighborhood.
You are the principal owner of EFID Business Solutions.
Yes, sir.
Which makes you an entrepreneur. You started your own business. After working for others, you decided that you were going to strike out on your own. I applaud that. I think that more African Americans should be entrepreneurs. What have been your challenges of entrepreneurship?
That is an interesting question. I think the biggest and so when I talk through this experience, I'm going to talk through, my actual for-profit businesses, starting a school, and then actually when I lived in Alexandria, I helped just to found a church. And I think, some of the common threads there, or, trying to identify, build a clientele, which I like. It just, it's all about your messaging. But I think the biggest challenges that I've seen is probably in kind of the red tape, working with our local governments and getting things set up. And so that whether it be permitting and things that are required for your buildings, getting tax systems set up and things like that. If you start a business and you get your tax certificate, and I had to teach my daughter this, you get your tax certificate and then you don't sell anything, and you're still required to turn in a tax report each month or each quarter, and you don't sell anything, you don't turn your tax report in, you get these like huge ridiculous fines. And so I think, which I've said before, I think that as a city government, like we have some room to grow in helping entrepreneurs and businesses to understand their relationship with the government, and that's at the state and the local level. So I think there's some work that we can do there. I think also the Fair Share program that four council ladies back in 2008 tried to push, and then I served on as a member of the task force. I think the inclusiveness from our parish government, again, is where we have some room to grow. So one of the things that I found like extremely disturbing is when the task force first came about, or when the ordinance was first introduced, and then we had the task force. The administration at that point provided this report of all these minority contractors. And so the perception of what a black-owned business in Baton Rouge is like has evolved quickly. So the folks that were identified on the list of black contractors for the city of Baton Rouge were the crossing guards. And that was the argument, that we're doing a lot of businesses with black business owners. But these were crossing guards who were 1099s. All right. And so I think the openness and inclusiveness, which, we've made some progress, but we're nowhere near what we need to be in 2020, again, compared to other cities. And so those are probably the biggest challenges that I've had, is mostly with relationship with our policymakers and our government.
The other problem that I would like to lift up has to do with how you identify a minority.
Yeah. You about to start something now.
White women are not minorities because usually they are propped up by white men who want to take advantage of government programs that are supposed to be designed for women and minorities. Emphasis on women and not necessarily on minorities. Have you seen that happen? I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I've seen it happen. And that was a huge contention point when the Fair Share program was being introduced by the four council ladies, and we had the task force. Like, that was a huge piece of the debate. Like, I've been in these conversations for years, even outside of the Fair Share program, with different entities and work that I've been involved in. And it's a common thing. It's a common thing. And I think I would think that white women would fight against it, actually, because if you fought and you scrapped to start your own business, and then you have a group of folks that continue to do this and perpetrate this myth, like, you would be an advocate against that type of practice. And so it's definitely something I've seen happen a number of times in a number of instances, both here in Baton Rouge and around the country.
I just thought I'd throw that out there. I don't want to run that far down that way, but I wanted to get back to the whole idea of entrepreneurship.
Yes, sir.
As an African American. You are deeply involved in your church, Way of Holiness Ministries. You're a deacon in your church. You're a Christian educator. What role do you see the church playing in fostering entrepreneurship among African Americans as we move forward in the 21st century?
So, actually, if I could applaud my church in that, I think, as an example, there were a few years ago, and I don't know if it's still in place, but the Louisiana Department of Economic Development, in partnership with the city of Baton Rouge, used to have technical assistance programs they provided to small businesses at the WIA office on Plank Road. All right. And so, again, I don't know if that's still in place, but definitely it's something that we need. And so what we used to do is, like, I would teach entrepreneurial classes through that program. And so the church, we had a lot of different people within the church that had, home-based businesses or whatever. So they would encourage them to participate. But we also would do similar things at our church. And so I think as a church body, again, you have caterers who don't have all their paperwork in place,
right.
But like they're cooking for the church all the time.
Right.
Seamstress, your IT guy over here. You have all these skills, basically, and then we have all sorts of skills like production, putting on productions and concerts and things like that. And so I think we should encourage our members, one, as a church body, we should encourage our members to pursue their crafts. Obviously, we bless the church and bless our community, so we should, one, be pursuing, encouraging our members to pursue their craft, but also, again, we have college professors in our churches. We have business, existing business owners in our churches. We should be teaching entrepreneurship within our churches. And so whether it be standalone, whether it be like sometimes we used to do these types of things. We might take one Sunday a month during Sunday school, put the Sunday school curriculum aside and talk about issues like business or social justice, or politics, or what have you. And so we have a platform, and I think even now, especially since like we've moved to a lot of this virtual activity, a lot of our people don't have anything to do, and so as a church body, I think it'd be a great tool to be able to use like our social media platforms, our virtual platforms, to put on virtual workshops and seminars during this time where people just don't have things to do. And so that's the role that I see the church playing. I also feel like, and I'm sure you've seen this before, oftentimes there are clergy at the table in some of these conversations like ITEP or whatnot. And so I would like to see more of our clergy at the table, because there's other folks that are at the table. And so I'd like to see more of our folks at the table, again, when it comes to policy decisions about business, entrepreneurship, or many of the other issues that we've been talking about here today.
I'm gonna let that pitch go too. We're wrapping up. Normally, I ask questions at the end about your children and whether or not you want them to live in this city. I know it's their decision, but as a parent, you have an opinion about that. I think I would end today by simply giving you the opportunity to say whatever it is you wanted to say with regard to your candidacy for Metro Council District 1.
Well, actually, I will end with what you just alluded to. I have actually purposely tried to keep my children out of this. Don't mention the names. I mean, people know who my kids are, but I've tried to keep them out of this. But at the end of the day, what I will say is that, and hold me if I get a little misty-eyed, I've watched, with the recent pandemic and the recent uprising around, killing the black people, I've watched my children evolve, get engaged in this. I've always been involved in things. I've tried to pull them into things and just keep them civically minded. But understand that they're children. And so they've gone into adulthood, preteens, teenagers. And so their eyes are open. They see the world that we live in. They see that we live in an unjust world. And, so one actually started a nonprofit to be able to try to pull back to kids in a lot of the underserved communities that are struggling and that we all often talk about. But I think she also realized that there are kids in her own community that she's grown up in. And, she has a level of privilege. But she also understands that the kids that have grown up in our own community that don't have or not as fortunate as she has been. And so I think at the end of the day, I want Baton Rouge to be the type of city that other folks can look to as a model for how we come together, how we work together, how we invoke change, and how we evolve. Because at the end of the day, like, the city is not where I think it should be, and it's not representative of its people. And so I do think that we have to have a great evolution within our city. And so whether my children decide to live here or not, me and their mom have tried to equip them with the skills and knowledge that they need to, again, be able to control their own destiny, because I never want anybody else to control my kids' destiny. And so if they decide that this is a place they want to be, it's because of their own choices. But I think I want Baton Rouge to be the type of city to equip all of our children to be able to make decisions and choices for their own lives. And if you look at, too often, if we're honest with ourselves, if we look at many of the folks that are struggling and many of the challenges that they have, at the end of the day, we got too many people controlling what's going on with them. And people live off that. They thrive off that. And so I think that I may be a bit of a troublemaker, because I think people need to be loosed and given the power to make their own decisions. And that's the type of city that I want to live in.
Thank you for taking the time to share with us. Eric Lewis, Metro Council District 1 candidate.
Yes, sir.
Again, we appreciate you coming by and sharing with us. Thank you all for viewing. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back again next time.